Hi everyone and welcome. I'm out here in my yard, and what I've got here is a glass table that I'm using to shelter a couple worm bins that I've got out here. And it's been a week since I last checked in on these systems here. It's a little bit blurry looking through this glass table, but we've got three systems here, one of which is a collection of old castings that I had actually rushed out of my wormery thinking that the material in them had been tainted. There was a lot of mites in it. In some cases I did some worm rescues out of the material, and for quite a while the stuff just sat out here in my yard doing nothing. And in the other two containers is the contents of what used to be my outdoor worm bag. And actually a part of what had been combined with the material that's in these two bins has already been used and recycled to start off my new edition of my outdoor worm bag. Specifically, I had taken the contents of the worm bag and filtered it and sifted it, and all the fine stuff, particle matter that came through, all the nice fine castings, as well as what I assumed to be a bunch of cocoons, were placed down here into this larger tub. And then what had gotten caught in the filter, which was pretty much the worms as well as all the larger materials that had not broken down, in a subsequent pass after that, I had separated the worms from that material, and the worms were placed into some new bedding and a new environment in this little green container, and all that large particle material that got caught in the sieve was used to rebuild the outdoor worm bag that just got launched a couple days ago. So this stuff is sort of in one category and this stuff's in another category, but it's been a week now since we tended to all these materials here. And it seems like after a week they're probably due for another check-in. Just to get my mind around what's going on with these and where they're headed, I put together just a little information board like I do sometimes. So before we get started, I just thought I'd recap really quickly where we stand with these different situations going on. So like I said, the material in the container that you see closest to us is a combination, and basically what we're seeing here is depicted over here. It's a combination of what I had considered tainted material, all placed into a single bin, and then and this started maybe a week shy of 100 days ago at this point, quite a while ago, over a course of between 93 and 86 days ago. Three systems kind of went south and were bought out here. And then it was only a month ago, 28 days ago, that I decided, you know what, maybe there's worms hanging out there, and I think we actually confirmed that there were worms hanging out in there. So we created a horizontal feeding zone within the bin to try to lure worms out of that. And then it was a week after that, 21 days ago. It's been actually 3 weeks now since we placed that last batch of food into that container. And last week when we checked in, we did notice that none of that food remained. We kind of expected this bin here to have a fairly small number of worms in it. So the I think it was a half of an eggplant or thereabouts that was placed in there 3 weeks ago. A week ago there was no sign of that. So maybe a week ago I should have probably already put food in there, because maybe there is more worms in here than I expect. But my intention was to actually put food in here this time, unlike last week. Last week all we did was check in there. And then onto the contents of the outdoor worm bag. Here too, we're simply placing food in here with the assumption that baby worms are emerging from their cocoons within this collection of castings and need food. So like we did last week, we're going to place some food in here. And here too, we've got worms, the worms that were taken from the outdoor worm bag that got fed a week ago. And they're also going to get food. So I'm actually planning on feeding all three. So I'm going to head inside and grab some food to do that with. And then we'll get started as soon as I've come back out here with some food and a glove. All right, so let's get started. So what you see here is a bag full of potato peels, frozen. And over here, quite obviously, it's 3 days worth of leftovers from the coffee machine. It's the used coffee grounds as well as the filters that those batches of coffee were run through. My aim was to, pretty much evenly distribute all this stuff amongst all three systems. And I guess the one weird thing about this system here, oh yeah, I've also got my pulverized eggshell here, which I was going to use as grit. So the one weird thing about this system was that we really thought to ourselves that this system has a very, very small number of worms living in it. And that's just based on, visual observation of the material in here and looking for worms last time. We found only a few, but there was also this sort of contradictory observation of a pretty good chunk of eggplant being put in here as food. You know, I broke it into a few pieces and spread it out. I thought to myself, you know, that stuff's never going to get eaten by those few worms that we observed in the system. But to our surprise, when we came in here a week ago, the stuff was gone. All of it had been consumed, I guess, somehow. I didn't know if it just sort of broke down on its own, or if like some sort of worms that are just hiding in this material actually came out of hiding to eat and then went back into hiding. Or maybe there's some other sort of creature, you know, residing in this bin, helping with the consumption of the food. I was out here working in another system yesterday where I did observe other creatures which appeared to be larvae. I thought they might have been the larvae of household flies, or at least that's what one of the viewers suggested that they might be. So I'm starting to wonder if maybe it wasn't even worms that consumed all that eggplant. Maybe it was maybe houseflies have moved in here and have been consuming the eggplant. So I'm very close to the point where I'd love to just do something with this population of worms that lives in here. So I have to assume that all these little seeds that we're seeing in here must track back to the eggplant. I guess it would make sense that seeds are going to take a little longer to break down, and these actually look like they're sprouting. That's what we're seeing here. So, you know, I guess we are starting to see some of the traces of the eggplant. I guess we just might have skimmed through here a little bit too quickly last time, and we might have missed them. So, you know, I did plan on throwing some peels in here, some potato peels and coffee, but I was also hoping to see some of the worms that live in here. So let me explain what makes this population of worms a little bit special to me. Now, if you're a regular on my channel, you'll know that I recently lost all the worms that resided in all my red wiggler systems back during that 83 to 94 days, or whatever that was, 94, 84, 93 days ago. In quick succession, all of my red wiggler bins sort of went through this sort of crash and burn situation, and that's how all this material just got thrown out here in the yard, assuming that the material was somehow too acidic or somehow tainted. I don't know, there was all kinds of theories going around, but I think I've settled on the assumption at this point that the material had just gone anaerobic, and some sort of you know, bacteria that thrives in anaerobic conditions had gone haywire within the system, pretty much leading to a bedding that the worms could just simply not breathe in anymore. Just, you know, lacking oxygen, worms dying off, and it does seem like some worms survived the ordeal and have made their way over into this fresh bedding that I had established for them to be able to move over into. And obviously the material that's on this side over here was left to air dry, and it has pretty much gone completely dry at this point. So I would have to say that over on this side there's got to be no worms remaining at this point. So at some point soon I'm going to launch off a isolated bin with only the few worms that reside in this container here, because in a way this seems like the only remaining trace of the original worm population that I had started out with. I started out with red wigglers, and you know, I had at one point had many bins with thousands of worms in them, and then within a matter of just a few short weeks I had pretty much lost them all. And whether these over here are worms that have come out of the cocoons that all those worms left behind, or if some of these are actually survivors from that ordeal, in my mind they're just the last remaining descendants of my original worm population that I started out this whole hobby with. So from a sentimental perspective, I kind of like the idea of sort of restoring my population of red wigglers using these to a certain degree, but keeping them separate, so I can really say that, you know, the worms that are in here are ones that can actually track their lineage back to the worms that I originally started out with. So it might seem a little bit corny, but that's the only reason I'm thinking of keeping these separate from any other red wigglers that I might eventually be able to recoup my red wiggler population with, because I've also got red wigglers living in my outdoor compost barrel, many of them, lots and lots of them actually. And in a way I would almost have to assume that those also to a certain degree track back to this my original population, but I can't say that for sure. Who knows? Maybe the red wigglers just came out of the soil, and maybe they were here already when I moved into the property. So I don't know for certain that the worms that live in my compost barrel are in fact from my original worm population or not. These are the ones that I could say for certain are. So it's my sentimental reason for thinking that I'd like to try to get these worms going at some point in a new indoor worm bin in my wormery, isolated from any other worms, so that maybe I could build up their population and, you know, get them back on their feet at some point. Maybe just as good as they were in their heyday. So that's kind of my weird backstory for this particular batch of red wigglers. You know, we bumped into a dozen or more while we were looking through here. It's certainly not a lot. It's certainly not an impressive number, but it's the only reason I'm kind of keeping them separate. And, you know, after all the time that they've had out here, I am thinking that at some point soon it's time to sort of establish a bin for them. A bin that, you know, no longer includes all of this old material that I had at one point considered to be tainted. And just kind of get them going. You know, all this sort of compost that they've been living in here for a while is starting to break down nicely. It was mainly leaves, and a lot of it's breaking down nicely into sort of a leaf mold, and the worms do seem pretty happy and healthy within it. There's been a little bit of food applied here periodically, so hopefully we're giving them enough to keep them going. Even if not, all this bedding would serve as a food source for them as well. So I don't think there's a great deal of reason to be worried about them, but I do believe that the next phase of the life cycle for this particular batch of worms is to eventually get them into a new home of their own, even if it's a small one, and help them kind of, I don't know, grow, you know, grow their population up and see what I can do with them. Treat it as a little bit of a special side project test, if you will. All right, so I'm glad I gave them food this go around. I'll be curious to see how they do with it and how quickly it gets used up and how long it lasts. But we're on to the worms and the material that came out of the outdoor worm bag. So let's get that stuff out here next. Oh yeah, geez, I almost forgot. I wanted to include a little bit of grit as long as I was here. So I always feel like there's a certain point in time where I don't want to backpedal to make up for missed steps, but I figured as long as the container was still up here on the bench and it's easy enough to do so, I'm going to drop in a little grit for these guys too. Just one of my trademark maneuvers is to forget something. All right, on to the next bin. Okay, so what's next is the worms, and then we'll do the cocoons last. So there was a little reference to a couple of those timelines on the illustration that I showed you earlier. I've already taken that inside, so I don't have it handy, but I did sort of show the bin that we just checked in on leading to one final outcome, and then these two systems that we're checking on next are leading to a separate outcome. And basically it's very similar. You know, I want to have two, when it's all said and done, I want to have two new red wiggler bins in my wormery downstairs, one of which will be based on the worms here that came out of the outdoor worm bag, as well as the cocoons that the worms that come from the cocoons that came out of that same system, you know, reunited into a common population, which should be something in the neighborhood of about 1,000 worms. I believe it was about 1,000 worms that we estimated this to have in it, this container here. And then like I said earlier, another one, which is probably a significantly smaller population, isolated and kept separate, because I think it's, you know, the only throwback to my original worms that I started with way back when. So I was a little worried about the material in this being possibly not covered thoroughly enough, and maybe allowing for excess evaporation to occur, but down at the bottom it does seem like we've got a good amount of moisture. I had placed in a bunch of frozen green beans last time we checked in on this system. I fed with a pretty generous number of green beans, and they were placed right down the middle. So I guess we'll just sort of start scanning across here. That outer edge seemed nice, full of worms, lots of them. Nice moisture level down there. Down here through the middle is where we would have placed in the green beans. But from my recollection, anytime I've ever fed with green beans, they've always been a really popular item and get consumed quite quickly. And I would think that in a system like this with approximately 1,000 worms in it, it's realistic to think that in a week's time there wouldn't be a whole lot, if any, left over of a feeding that consisted of green beans. So I think that's pretty much my expectation, and it is consistent that we're seeing really no signs of the green beans here. It's part of the reason I thought that it would be a good time to come back in here and check back, make sure these little guys have everything they need to continue. So this time they're going to get something that might not be quite as yummy as the green beans. They're going to get those potato peels. Look at all those worms. Nice turnout in here, right? Like I said, I think we estimated about 1,000 worms making up this population when we had a pretty good look at them, when we had separated them from the material that they had been inhabiting previously. So yeah, a population of 1,000 worms generally burns away their food supply pretty quickly. All right, so let's drop in the stuff they're getting. I guess I'll try to leave some of this grassy stuff at the bottom as a little bit of a foundation to place today's feeding on top of. Here too, we're gonna give them a little bit of this potato peel. Oh, I left a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, I guess, for the cocoon nursery that we're gonna check last. There too, we had placed in some stuff similarly, and in there I have really no clue as to what kind of a population might live in there, but it'll give us a clue when we see how much, if any, of the green beans they got last week remain. And I guess if there's some leftovers, that might be a good thing, because so few potato peels were left. I guess I didn't distribute them evenly. So the grass clippings seem to be something that the worms are enjoying. I placed them in here based on feedback some of the people in my comments, in the video comments, were suggesting was that grass clippings might work well in a bin. A lot of people provided feedback saying that they always have good results with them, so I figured I'd grab some and throw them in here, since I had just cut the grass shortly before that point in time. And it does look like the stuff is gradually breaking down, and it's making for a pretty nice top layer of material in here. So this looks like it's coming along pretty good. I guess the other reason this stuff has been sitting out here and has not yet been moved inside is because the worm population, when we were picking through them, did seem to have some black soldier fly larvae living in here within the material along with the worms. And I figured over a few weeks' time those larvae would have an opportunity to transform from being larvae into flies and fly away, crawl out of the bin and fly away. Let's get some grit in here too. I almost forgot. And then I'll feel like when I move this population of worms inside, I'm not bringing in a bunch of insects as well alongside the worms. So that's the main reason I've been sort of quarantining them out here, and hopefully we can move these inside as a new bin full of worms. They'll go into a new bin, a larger bin, but it'll still be treated as the same population that we started 4 weeks ago here, or 29 days ago, I believe, to be exact. All right, on to the cocoon nursery. Now, if you're into worm composting like I am, you'll know that a bin full of castings like this is heavy. So I was kind of surprised after those 2 containers that we just worked on. one of them full of castings, but dried out castings, and another container that's fairly small in size. What the heck? They're extremely light, and this bin is extremely heavy in comparison, in stark contrast. So now he's kind of, I don't know what the heck's going on here. Maybe it's just sort of like a rift. Maybe the stuff on this side had sort of stuck together, and maybe the collapse of the intersection where the food was resulted in sort of just a I don't know what they call this. It's almost like a fault line, right? Like the San Andreas Fault in California. Every now and then when the earthquakes shake, you get these fault lines and cracks in the earth. So at first I was worried that maybe some creature had gotten here and was burrowing through here and maybe hunting worms or something. So I'm just going to assume that there was a collapse of the food that we placed in here a week ago, and that that's what we were seeing. So I'm going to try not to react. So the green beans were placed right down the middle. I'm not even sure what leftovers of green beans might look like, but I'm seeing some stuff here, some kind of stringy stuff. Is that what green beans look like after they've been, for the most part, consumed? Maybe there's just some fibrous part of the food that remains afterwards. And I guess if you look in the spot in a worm bin where the food had just been, it's not surprising to find worms. So besides baby worms emerging from their cocoons in the system, I've also got to assume that some baby worms just made their way through the screening process when I was filtering the material. So I guess in total, the population of this system would consist of, not only cocoons hatched here, baby worms that hatched out of their cocoons here, but also possibly some of the larger ones that we find that might have already been worms when we filtered, but were such small worms that they just passed through the screen as part of the screening process. And I'll be really curious to see how many worms we managed to pull together out of this system. These I assume are red wigglers, based on the fact that I assume that the majority of the population in my compost barrel are red wigglers, and the compost barrel is where I had sourced the population of my outdoor worm bag. And I've always thought that the period of time that it takes for cocoons to hatch out of red wiggler cocoons, at least, is somewhere between 21 and 24 days. So now we're at that point where we've already exceeded that period of time required for red wiggler cocoons to hatch. So I am kind of going a little bit slow to see if I can spot a cocoon or two while I'm doing this. I thought I saw some earlier on, but there's also seeds in here, mixed in. I mean, clearly a seed like this you wouldn't mistake as a worm cocoon, but other types of materials that would have been in this material could easily be mistaken to be a worm cocoon. So like here, for example, I don't know if I'm going to be able to grab it because they are so tiny, but here on the oops, there it goes again. But bottom line is I'm definitely seeing cocoons in here. And it does also make sense that they're all pretty dark in color. Perhaps this one here is not as dark as the one I had on my finger a moment ago. But when I touch this one, it feels like this one is already empty, like the baby worms had already emerged from it. The plastic covering on this one is doing a pretty nice job keeping the moisture in here. I did expect to find moisture right where the foods had been placed last, but even out here on the edges, even though the material seems to flow quite nicely, I could feel it in my hands that it's still got a pretty good moisture content to it, and it's nice and cool to the touch. So I do believe that the plastic coverings I'm using are preserving the moisture level of this stuff adequately to keep it as a nice, comfortable material for the worms to live in. I think for now we're just going to stick to what we did last time, which is to drop the food that we're giving them right down the middle, make it easily accessible from all directions for all the worms in the bin. But perhaps the next time we come in here, we might switch gears a little bit and switch our feedings to be a more targeted type of feeding. And what I mean by that is to say that we'll give them food, but we're going to place that food into a particular spot within the bin, which will at that point be geared for the collection of the worms in the material. So I do believe that the next feeding that we apply to this, which might be in another week or so, will probably be a migration based type feeding, with the objective of rounding up the worms that have you know, either slipped into the system as part of the screening process, or worms that have been born here. All right, so let's get their food into here and then we'll be done. It's a pretty full bin, you know, and it's quite heavy. So regrettably, we've already depleted the majority of the food I bought out here for these little guys. I wish I can give them more, but I guess the benefit to them not having straight up feedings and a food supply given to them explicitly the way I'm doing now is that it kind of forces them to turn their attention to the other materials floating around within the bin, you know. So there's always going to be little scraps of stuff throughout, which they can also utilize as a food. Not to mention the fact that worms can always re-ingest their castings numerous times too, so there should certainly be no fear of these little guys going hungry. And besides that, I guess it's probably a good idea to start building up their hunger, so that when we do finally feed them with a targeted type of a feeding. Oh, how do you like that? We forgot to give the coffee to the previous bin, and you know what? It's to the fortune of these little guys here, because they're going to get it. So yeah, you know, once they plow through this feeding here, they will start getting hungry, and they'll be motivated. They'll be motivated to gravitate towards the section of the bin that I set up to collect them, and it should hopefully you know, speed along that process of collecting them. So I don't know, what the heck, let's put this in here too. I do feel like sometimes we're a little bit skimpy on the bedding, and lots and lots of bedding has been sort of the theme on my channel lately, so let's just give them these 2 pieces of paper, which is ultimately a good source of carbon, and perhaps not so much bedding, but a carbon food source for them to balance out the nitrogen rich food that they were just given. And I guess we'll get a chance to see how that paper gets broken down over time. Perhaps we'll see some significant evidence of hungry worms by seeing that paper nibbled down significantly the next time we check in here. So that'll be a curious thing to check in on next time we come in here. All right, it's always fun checking in on these systems, but I sometimes feel like I've got to really regroup and rethink where I'm heading with these things, just so I can stay on point and make sure that my actions all support the end goal. And not only that, but just remind myself of what the goal is, so that I can, you know, tailor all of my actions and stuff to make sure they're all in support of a successful end product or final state. Okay, so let's see, how was this set up? We had a sheet of paper across the top. Here too, I believe that these nibbles are also probably good evidence of the fact that they're craving a carbon-based food source. So they are coming up to nibble on the paper. So maybe they're really going to appreciate that paper that we sunk down below the surface, those coffee filters, and maybe we'll see similar nibbling evidence on those as well. All right, everyone, that's it for today's check-in on my outdoor systems, which in the end will all eventually transform into indoor red wiggler worm bins. But for now, they remain outside. All right, everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.